Now, one of the keys here is that I want to do the -x, which allows me to do the X11 forwarding. Why, yes, I do. Okay, well, it doesn't look a whole lot different, but what we're trying to do is run an app. So let's see what happens when I try that. So I suppose it's worth having this particular error. And the problem, of course, is that we don't have a display for this particular connection. And that's the problem or the challenge associated with X11 forwarding. I will talk more about that here in a second, but let's try something. So here we are back on the server, and what I'm going to do is try to give the connection a display. And so I can take a look at my display variable, right? But I have to be aware that I'm just Bruce at this particular machine. So maybe what we'll do is I'm going to SU as root here. So I'm going to change who I am because I'm going to do something that allows those remote users to have an X server. And so if I take a look at my display again, right, what I want to be able to do is give the folks connecting a display on this machine in a nutshell. So I'm going to export. Whoa, I'm not going to do that. Display. And what are we going to do? We're going to do something called localhost. Like that. Whoops. Like that. All right, so here's our server. This is one of the common response to this, right? We might have to export the display. But as a reminder, if you are on the server and you have allowed X11 forwarding, and then we go over to the client, and let's see. You have gone down here and, good gracious. The other thing we want to allow is X11 forwarding on the client. And then we go ahead and try it, see what happens with the -x option. Now let's see what happens. There we have it. Now there is X11 forwarding, and this application is not running on this VM. It's actually running over here. Okay, at this point I think it's appropriate to talk about X11 forwarding in the larger context. All right, so as we're going through our OpenSSH configuration, right, we have to remember that there's a server side and a client side. We saw where the server side configuration is, and then you got a host-based configuration file as well. The client side is pretty simple. The server side is got all the options in it, but you can go to, there's no reason to go into this totally confused, right? OpenSSH has a website. You can go out there and take a look at the config items. You can take a look at what everything means in the configuration file, and you can get sample configs as to what constitutes a decent configuration. The website is basically the same thing as the man pages, but there are other options out there. Now, with regard to X11 forwarding over SSH, well, X11 forwarding, we have to go back a couple of jumps to understand what in the world we're talking about. So X is really sort of the short name or the generic name, as it says here, for the X Windows system display driver, right? When you are on a Windows 10 system, there's some set of software that shows you all the stuff. Well, X Windows does the same thing on the Linux side. When we're doing X11 forwarding, right, you are trying to see a GUI on the other end. Now, if you screw up where your servers are, right, what we need is X11 servers on both sides. So when we are doing X11 forwarding, if you have an oops, you might actually cause an application to be run on the other side and only pop up there. So it's important to realize that you need a server on your side. Now, if you're doing the Windows thing, you might need something like Xming. But in OpenSSH, what we're doing here is if you have a desktop, you probably have an X server just fine, and everything now comes down to, did you configure your config files correctly? Now, as we know, the X11 display variable can be a pain sometimes. Sometimes it just doesn't get passed. Even in the OpenSSH documentation, it talks about the display variable being a potential security risk or a security vector for bad guys. So there are other and arguably better options to doing X11 forwarding over an SSH connection. The two big ones right there are RDP or XRDP. So now we know what the X is for. And then VNC. My favorite application to use there is Tiger VNC. So I use XRDP all the time. I would much rather do that than do X11 forwarding over SSH. It's a separate program, and if I wanted to SSH into something, I'm going to be doing command line anyway. But if I want the desktop, because I'm doing development and I want to have a bunch of terminal windows and have access to the file system and all of that, then, maybe I'll do RDP or XRDP. And I do that between Windows and Linux all the time. But anyway, that's a little more on the where X comes from, why in the world we say things like X11 forwarding, where this sort of idea of X comes from. Now, one last thing that I'll mention is the SSH keys. Maybe we'll jump over to our VMs again. All right, if I take a look at my directory here, I can see that I've got my keys, and the keys are the public and private key pair that have been generated. Now, what in the world are we talking about, and why do we have things like RSA keys? What are these about? What's the magic here? Well, RSA is actually where we come from. Well, what we have to recognize is a couple of things. One is that this server started off with a public and private key pair. And when you connect, it asks you, do you want this public key? All right? Do you want this signature? And then in the course of our connection, you're going to spin up a session key for that particular connection. But what's really this whole public and private key pair thing all about? Well, remember that, first of all, we do have these two keys. And we talked a little bit about this before, but when you are connecting and I want to encrypt something for somebody, if they've given me their public key, what I can do is encrypt with that public key and then forward it to them, and they will decrypt it with the private key. So it's really important to understand that the public and private keys work together. And there is an algorithm behind how that works, right? That's the modulo arithmetic on the really high prime numbers. Well, where does RSA come from? Well, these fabulous folks here, Rivest, Shamir, and Edelman. Way back in 1977, they described the algorithm. So when we talk about RSA keys, that's why. It's named after these three guys. Okay, now we use the public and private key pairings all over the place. When you're looking at secure web pages and things like that, you're using the public and private key pair. The public key is part of a certificate in that case. So there's lots and lots of places that we use public and private key pairs other than SSH. Now these keys were part of this initial build. If I wanted to, I could change these keys, and in fact I probably ought to. I'm just not going to take the time to do that right now because this video is getting a little bit long. But I would use SSH keygen to change the keys and replace these here. And that also makes sense to do because I'm talking about clones, right? So the command that I might actually use to do that would be this. You know, like that. And you would follow the steps through. I'm not going to do that because this video is getting a little bit long anyway. And really all that we would be doing is replacing the public and private key pair on this machine. Well, I think that'll about do it for this particular video. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. I hope this helps. Subscribe and like, and may your packets always reach their secure destinations.